In the mist-shrouded mountains of Japan lies a secret that has been guarded for centuries. Ancient tablets written in a divine script that predates all known human languages. These documents, known as the Takenouchi manuscripts, contain a startling revelation, detailed accounts of divine beings called the Sumera Mikoto, who descended from the heavens in floating ships to rule humanity during a golden age of peace. Remarkably, these Japanese texts mirror, almost precisely, the Sumerian cuneiform tablets describing the Anunnaki, beings who from heaven to earth came. Tonight, we journey across continents and millennia to explore what many consider the most profound archaeological mystery of our age: the possibility that Japan preserved the original record of humanity's true origins. In the stillness of this moment, we begin a journey together, a journey that will carry us across vast oceans and through the corridors of forgotten time, a journey that spans not merely centuries, but millennia upon millennia of human memory and divine mystery. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet comfort of wherever you find yourself listening, we shall explore one of the most fascinating enigmas that has captured the imagination of seekers and scholars alike. An ancient puzzle that connects two civilizations separated by thousands of miles of land and sea, yet somehow bound together by stories so remarkably similar that one cannot help but wonder if they spring from a single forgotten source. The soft chime of shrine bells echoes across mist-shrouded mountains in distant Japan, while the warm winds of the desert whisper secrets through the crumbling ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. And somewhere in the space between these two worlds lies a mystery waiting to be contemplated. What if the oldest stories ever told about where humanity came from were preserved not only in the clay tablets of Sumer, but also in the sacred scrolls of the Far East? What if two cultures that seemingly never met somehow remembered the same divine beings, the same cosmic events, the same primordial truths about our origins as a species? The Anunnaki, that enigmatic group of deities worshipped by the ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, have long fascinated those who seek to understand the earliest chapters of human civilization. Yet few realize that half a world away, in the island nation of Japan, there exist ancient texts that speak of remarkably similar beings who descended from the heavens to guide humanity in its infancy. This is not a lecture, but rather an invitation to wonder, a gentle exploration of possibilities that asks nothing of you except your willingness to listen and to dream. Let the sounds of the night settle around you as we begin this contemplative voyage through time and space. The civilization we know as Sumer emerged in the historical region of southern Mesopotamia, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Ages, somewhere between the 5th and 4th millennium before the Common Era, making it what many scholars consider to be the earliest known civilization in human history. These remarkable people, who called themselves the black-headed people, developed writing, built towering temple complexes called ziggurats, created complex systems of law and governance, and left behind thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script that tell us stories of gods and heroes and the very creation of the world itself. The Sumerian language is the oldest attested language known to humanity, dating back to at least 3,100 years before the Common Era, and perhaps even earlier, preserved on tablets that have survived ravages of time to whisper their secrets to those patient enough to decipher them. Among the most intriguing figures in the Sumerian pantheon are the Anunnaki, divine beings whose name has been interpreted to mean those who from heaven to earth came, deities described in the earliest Sumerian writings as descendants of An, the god of the heavens, and Ki, the goddess of earth. The Sumerian religious cosmos was populated by a rich array of divine figures, including An, who ruled the heavens above, Enlil, the powerful god of wind and storm, who commanded the forces of nature, and Enki, the wise god of water and human culture, who was often portrayed as a friend and protector of humanity. In ancient texts like the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki appear as creators and judges, sometimes benevolent guides, and sometimes demanding overlords who shaped the destiny of humankind according to their divine will. These stories, carved into clay thousands of years ago, speak of a time when gods walked among mortals, when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin enough to cross, when divine beings descended from the sky to establish the first cities and teach humanity the arts of civilization. Picture, if you will, those ancient temple cities rising from the flat Mesopotamian plain, their stepped pyramids reaching toward the stars, their priests keeping sacred records of divine pronouncements and cosmic events that shaped the world. Now let us turn our attention eastward, across the vast expanses of the Asian continent, across mountain ranges and steppes, and finally across the sea to the misty islands of Japan, where another tradition has preserved its own memories of the age when gods ruled the earth. The Kojiki, an early Japanese chronicle of myths and legends and hymns and genealogies and oral traditions and semi-historical accounts, is usually considered to be the oldest extant literary work in Japan, a sacred text that has shaped the spiritual identity of a nation for more than 1,000 years. But there exists another set of documents, far more controversial and mysterious, that some believe contain an even older record of human and divine history. The Takenouchi manuscripts, also known as the Takenouchi Documents, are a set of mysterious texts that, according to tradition, were rewritten by a man named Takenouchi no Motori some 1,500 years ago, though legends claim that the original documents were written in divine characters many millennia before that by the gods themselves. The existence of these documents was first publicly revealed in the modern age in 1910 by Kiyomaru Takeuchi, an esoteric Shinto priest who claimed to be the descendant of the ancient family entrusted with guarding these sacred writings through countless generations. Much of what is written in the Takenouchi Documents sounds incredible to modern ears. Yet those who have studied them suggest that they reveal a hidden history in which Japan was once the source of all human civilization, the original homeland from which divine wisdom spread to every corner of the globe. The original documents were believed to have been written in a mystical script from the age of the gods, a divine language that supposedly contained all the elements of all human languages, including Hebrew and Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphics, and even Sumerian, as though it were the mother tongue from which all earthly speech descended. Within these texts we encounter a figure of supreme importance, the Sumera Mikoto, described as a divine emperor who ruled over a unified world during a golden age, long since forgotten by conventional history. Here we arrive at perhaps the most tantalizing connection between these two ancient traditions, separated by such vast distances of geography and time. The seventh generation of divine beings, according to the Takenouchi Documents, marked the beginning of the lineage of world emperors, a dynasty that began with the Sumera Mikoto, an ancient Japanese title that some have translated as the Son of the Sun. Historically, the emperors of Japan were called Sumera Mikoto, a title whose meaning has been debated by scholars, but which some believe literally means God of Sumera, a term that bears a striking phonetic resemblance to the name Sumer, that ancient civilization in distant Mesopotamia. The official interpretation suggests that Sumera Mikoto means something like uniting as a whole, a reference to the emperor's role as the one who brings harmony to the realm. Yet alternative, researchers have long been intrigued by the possibility that this linguistic similarity points to a deeper historical connection. According to Mutsuyasu Takeuchi, the head of the family that has traditionally guarded these documents, the Japanese Sumer race, which he identifies with the imperial lineage, once traveled around the Western countries in ancient times, and this Sumer group came to be called Sumerian and built the Sumerian civilization that we know from archaeology and ancient history. Whether this represents genuine historical memory or later mythological elaboration remains a question that cannot be easily answered, but the possibility alone invites us to wonder about connections between cultures that conventional history has never considered. Perhaps there is no direct link at all. Perhaps the similarity between Sumera and Sumer is nothing more than coincidence. One of those accidents of language that occur from time to time across unrelated tongues. Or perhaps, as some who have studied these traditions suggest, both names derive from some far more ancient source, some primordial word or concept that was carried to both Mesopotamia and Japan by peoples whose migrations we have long since forgotten. We need not decide tonight which interpretation is correct, for this journey is not about arriving at firm conclusions, but rather about opening ourselves to mystery and wonder, about contemplating the possibility that human history may be far stranger and more interconnected than we have been taught to believe. As we prepare to descend deeper into this exploration in the passages that follow, let the questions themselves be your companions. Let the uncertainty be not a source of frustration, but of fascination, for it is in the space between what we know and what we do not know that the most profound contemplation becomes possible. The shrine bells continue their gentle song across the mountains of Japan. The desert winds still whisper through the ruins of Sumer, and somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, perhaps the old gods still remember the truth of how it all began. And so we descend now into the heart of these mysterious documents, into the claims that have captivated researchers and dreamers alike for more than a century. And as we journey deeper into this ancient narrative, you may find yourself drifting between the waking world and the realm of dreams. For the story we are about to explore exists in that liminal space between history and myth, between the provable and the imagined. And it is here, in this gentle twilight of understanding, that the Takenouchi Documents reveal their secrets to those patient enough to listen. The documents themselves present an immediate mystery, for it remains unclear how Takenouchi Motori, that ancient scribe who lived some 1500 years ago, translated what was supposedly a divine language into something that human beings could comprehend. And yet, despite this uncertainty, the texts themselves paint a remarkably detailed picture of what their keepers call the divine era, a time so distant from our own that the numbers involved seem almost incomprehensible. to the modern mind. According to these weathered pages, 7 generations of heavenly gods ruled during the Tenjin era, each generation building upon the work of those who came before, each contributing to the slow and steady development of the cosmos as we would eventually come to know it. In the beginning, the documents tell us, the world existed as nothing more than a vast and formless sea of mud, a primordial chaos that stretched endlessly in all directions, and this state of formlessness persisted for a span of time that staggers the imagination. Some 22 billion years of slow and patient transformation before anything resembling order began to emerge from the darkness. Then, according to these ancient accounts, the first gods and goddesses emerged from this cosmic soup, bringing with them the light of consciousness and the power to shape reality itself. And it was through their divine will that the heavens and the earth were finally separated, pulled apart like curtains to reveal the stage upon which all of creation would eventually unfold. The sun and moon were created during this primordial awakening, those celestial bodies that would come to govern the rhythms of life for all creatures dwelling upon the earth. And with their creation, the basic architecture of the universe was finally complete, ready to receive the countless forms of life that would eventually call it home. The documents speak of progressive development across these divine generations, each era bringing new innovations and new possibilities to the young cosmos. And by the time of the 7th generation, something remarkable had begun to occur, for it was during this period that various beings developed technologies that seem almost modern in their sophistication. Transportation systems that could move people and goods across vast distances, writing systems that could preserve knowledge for future generations, methods for controlling the weather itself, advanced farming technologies that could coax abundance from even the most reluctant soil, and perhaps most surprisingly of all, devices that functioned much like what we today would call computers. Whether we are meant to understand these descriptions literally or symbolically remains one of the many mysteries surrounding these texts. But the image they paint is unmistakable, a portrait of an ancient civilization that had mastered the forces of nature in ways that we are only beginning to approach in our own modern age. The account of human creation found within the Takenouchi Documents departs dramatically from the evolutionary narrative that dominates our contemporary scientific understanding, for according to these texts, it was not blind natural selection that gave rise to humanity, but rather the deliberate creative act of divine beings who fashioned us according to their own design. The gods themselves created humans, we are told, and the sons of these gods went further still, creating 5 distinct types of colored people who would eventually spread across the face of the earth, each carrying within them the divine spark that had been placed there at the moment of their creation. This narrative of intentional creation, rather than gradual evolution, places the Takenouchi Documents firmly within a tradition that spans many ancient cultures, a tradition that sees humanity not as an accident of chemistry and time, but as the purposeful creation of beings far greater than ourselves. As you listen to these words, perhaps allowing your eyes to close and your breathing to slow, consider for a moment how this ancient understanding might have shaped the way those early humans saw themselves and their place in the cosmos. For to believe that you were created by divine hands for a divine purpose is to inhabit a very different psychological reality than to believe that you are merely the latest iteration of a long and purposeless chain of biological accidents. The documents describe a world government that emerged during the Koto era, a unified administration that brought all the peoples of the earth under a single benevolent rule. And at the center of this global order stood the Sumera Mikoto, the divine emperor whose authority extended to every corner of the known world. From his seat of power in what we now call Japan, the Sumera Mikoto divided the world into 16 distinct regions, each with its own appointed governor who ruled in the emperor's name, maintaining peace and prosperity across the entire planet. This image of a unified human civilization living in harmony under divine guidance represents one of the most persistent dreams of our species, the longing for a time before borders and wars and conflicts divided us into hostile camps, a golden age when all humanity recognized its common origin and lived accordingly. The Sumera Mikoto did not rule as a distant tyrant, but traveled extensively throughout his vast domain, visiting the peoples of every region and ensuring that his benevolent vision was being carried out by those he had appointed to govern in his absence. And here we encounter one of the most remarkable claims in all of the Takenouchi documents. For the texts tell us that the Sumera Mikoto traveled not by horse or ship or any conventional means of transportation, but rather in vessels that could fly through the air itself, craft called ameno ukipyun, which translates roughly as floating ships. These aerial vehicles carried the divine emperor across mountains and oceans with equal ease, allowing him to maintain his connection with subjects who lived thousands of miles apart. And the documents provide what their believers consider to be physical evidence of these remarkable journeys. The places where these floating ships touched down upon the earth were given names that incorporated the word hain, meaning winds, and even today one can find locations throughout Japan whose names preserve this ancient memory, silent testimony to landing sites that may have witnessed the arrival of the divine emperor in his miraculous flying vessel. Even today, one of the major airports serving Tokyo carries the name Haneda. And while modern linguists would offer different explanations for this etymology, those who believe in the Takenouchi documents see in this name an echo of a time when the skies above Japan were traveled by craft far more advanced than any modern airplane. The documents also speak of pyramids, those mysterious structures that have captured human imaginations since the earliest days of archaeological inquiry. And according to the Takenouchi texts, these great monuments served a very specific purpose in the ancient world order. Whether constructed entirely by human hands or sculpted from existing hills and mountains, these pyramidal structures were said to function as communication devices, allowing the Sumera Mikoto to maintain contact with the heavenly gods who had originally established his authority over the earth. The texts mention the building of numerous hiramita, shrines dedicated to receiving the sun god, and this detail has led some researchers to see connections between the Japanese documents and the pyramid building traditions of Egypt and Mesoamerica, suggesting perhaps a common source for these monumental undertakings. The image that emerges from these passages is of a sophisticated global civilization, one that had mastered not only the technologies of flight and agriculture, but also the means of communicating across the vast distances that separate the earth from the heavenly realms. Let these images settle gently into your mind as we continue our journey through the Takenouchi Documents, allowing the strange and beautiful world they describe to become a landscape through which your dreaming consciousness might wander. The ancient social system described in these documents was based fundamentally upon agriculture, that most basic of human activities, the coaxing of food from the willing earth. And in this golden age, the people cultivated the land not as owners but as stewards, farmers working the fields of the Sumera Mikoto, who held all land in trust for the gods themselves. This arrangement might seem strange to modern sensibilities accustomed to private property and individual ownership, but the documents describe it as a system of profound harmony and mutual benefit. For although the land was technically leased from the divine powers, the farmers who worked it paid no taxes and kept the fruits of their labor for themselves and their families. The Sumera Mikoto aimed not to extract wealth from his subjects, but to bring happiness to his people, and they in return loved and respected him with a devotion that transcended mere political loyalty, recognizing in their divine emperor the living connection between humanity and the heavenly powers that had created them. This portrait of a benevolent ruler beloved by his people represents another expression of that universal human longing for good governance, for leadership that serves rather than exploits, that elevates rather than oppresses. And whether the Takenouchi documents describe historical reality or express an idealized dream of what human society might become, the vision they offer resonates across the centuries with undiminished power. The documents record that this ultra-ancient civilization, far more advanced than anything we have achieved in our modern age, maintained an unbroken line of Sumera Mikoto rulers across countless generations, a dynasty of divine emperors whose authority extended to every inhabited region of the planet. But as with so many golden ages recorded in the mythologies of the world, this era of peace and prosperity was not destined to last forever. For the documents tell us that the ancient civilization was repeatedly struck by cataclysms of almost unimaginable destructive power. Floods and earthquakes, volcanic eruptions and cosmic disasters, each catastrophe erasing much of what had been built and forcing the survivors to begin again from the ruins of what had come before. The pattern of rise and fall, of achievement and destruction, echoes through these ancient pages like a mournful refrain, reminding us that even the greatest civilizations are ultimately fragile things, vulnerable to forces far beyond human control. As with many other ancient mythologies from cultures scattered across the globe, the golden era described in the Takenouchi documents eventually comes to an end, and the cause given for this fall from grace will sound familiar to anyone who has studied the sacred texts of other traditions. For it was human disobedience to the gods that ultimately brought destruction upon the ancient world. When humanity began to turn away from the divine order that had sustained civilization for countless generations, when pride and selfishness replaced humility and cooperation, the harmony that had existed between heaven and earth was broken, and the cataclysms that followed were the inevitable consequence of this cosmic rupture. This narrative of a fall from grace, of paradise lost through human failing, appears in traditions as diverse as the Hebrew Bible and the Greek myths, the Hindu Puranas and the Norse Eddas, and its presence in the Takenouchi documents suggests either a common historical memory shared by all these cultures or a common psychological truth about the human condition that finds expression wherever. humans gather to tell stories about their origins. Perhaps the most extraordinary claims found within the Takenouchi Documents concern the visits of historical sages and religious founders to Japan during the ancient era. For according to these texts, figures such as Moses and Jesus, Muhammad and Lao Tzu all traveled to Japan to study the mystical arts preserved there since the beginning of time. This claim positions Japan not merely as one civilization among many, but as the original source of all spiritual wisdom, the fountainhead from which all the world's religions ultimately flow. The central tenet that emerges from these accounts is that all religion, in fact, has one root, a single divine truth that was preserved in its purest form in Japan and then carried outward to the rest of the world by these various prophets and teachers who had come to drink from the original well of wisdom. The specific narrative concerning Jesus preserved in the Takenouchi Documents is perhaps the most startling of all these claims, for according to these texts, it was not Jesus Christ who was crucified at Golgotha, but rather his younger brother Isukiri, who took his place upon the cross so that Jesus might escape and continue his mission. The documents tell us that upon being captured by the Romans, Jesus managed to escape by switching places with his brother, who willingly accepted death so that the true teacher might live. And Jesus himself then journeyed to Japan, where he lived out the remainder of his long life, eventually dying and being buried in a location that some believers claim to have identified in modern Japan. These extraordinary claims have understandably generated enormous controversy, challenging as they do the fundamental narratives of the world's major religions. And the keepers of the Takenouchi Documents have paid a heavy price for making these assertions public. In April of 1936, Takenouchi Kiyomaru, the priest who had first revealed the documents to the modern world, was indicted for blasphemy by the Japanese authorities, charged with disrespecting the established religious order through his promotion of these heterodox texts. The Mito District Court found him guilty in March of 1942, a verdict that seemed to confirm the official rejection of the documents as fraudulent or heretical. But the story did not end there, for in December of 1944, the Supreme Court reversed this judgment and found Takenouchi Kiyomaru not guilty, though by this point the damage had already been done. During the legal proceedings, as many as 4,000 items of sacred treasures, along with the Takenouchi documents themselves, were confiscated by the court and stored in facilities that would prove tragically vulnerable to the fires of war. These irreplaceable artifacts, the physical evidence that believers claimed supported the extraordinary narratives contained in the documents, were lost in the Tokyo air raids during World War II, consumed by the flames that reduced so much of Japan's cultural heritage to ashes. And so we are left with a mystery wrapped in tragedy, ancient documents that claim to preserve the original history of humanity, destroyed before modern scholarship could subject them to rigorous analysis, their loss ensuring that the questions they raised will likely never be definitively answered. Some see in this loss evidence of a deliberate cover-up, an attempt by powers threatened by the truths contained in these documents to ensure that those truths would never reach the wider world. Others see simply the random destruction of war, the indifferent flames consuming treasures and trash alike without any regard for their significance. Whatever the truth may be, the destruction of the original documents has ensured that the Takenouchi texts will remain forever in that ambiguous realm between history and legend. Their claims neither fully proven nor definitively refuted, inviting each generation to examine them anew and draw their own conclusions. As you drift deeper into relaxation, let these mysteries settle into the quiet places of your mind, neither demanding resolution nor permitting dismissal, simply resting there as questions that may never find their final answers. And perhaps that is as it should be, for some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but rather to be contemplated, turning them over and over in the mind like smooth stones worn by countless years of patient water, their beauty lying not in any final revelation, but in the endless play of possibility and wonder that they inspire. And now we turn our gaze toward the cradle of civilization itself, toward the sun-baked plains between two rivers where humanity first learned to write its stories into clay, where the first cities rose from the earth like dreams made solid, and where the gods themselves were said to walk among mortals in the days before memory. The Sumerians, those black-headed people as they called themselves, envisioned their universe as something both intimate and vast, a great dome rising above the earth like an overturned bowl, surrounded on all sides by primordial waters that had existed since before time itself had meaning. Beneath the dome stretched the terrestrial earth, solid and nurturing, and beneath that lay deeper mysteries still, an underworld where the dead wandered in shadow, and a vast freshwater ocean called the Abzu, from which all springs and rivers drew their life-giving waters. The deity of that dome-shaped firmament, the endless sky that watched over all creation, was named An, and the earth herself, fertile and patient, was called Ki, and from their union came all the gods who would shape the destiny of humanity. This cosmic architecture, this vision of reality as layered and purposeful, resonates across millennia with an almost musical quality. And when we hold it alongside the cosmology preserved in Takenouchi Documents, we begin to hear harmonies that perhaps should not exist between civilizations separated by such vast distances of ocean and mountain and desert. In the Sumerian telling, the great gods known as the Anunnaki dwelt in heavenly palaces, beings of immense power and subtle intention, while beneath them labored the lesser gods called the Igigi, who toiled endlessly to maintain the order of creation, digging the canals, tending the fields, performing the ceaseless work that kept the cosmos turning. But the Igigi grew weary, they grew resentful, and in a moment that would change everything, they rebelled against their divine labor, casting down their tools and refusing to continue. It was then, according to the ancient texts, that the Anunnaki conceived of a solution both elegant and profound. And, working alongside the mother goddess Mami, they fashioned a new kind of being from the clay of the earth mixed with the blood of a slain god, creating humanity to take up the burden that the Igigi had laid down, to work the fields and dig the canals and offer prayers to the heavens. Humans were created, in this telling, to relieve the gods of labor, to be the hands that tended creation while the divine minds contemplated higher mysteries. And here, in this ancient narrative of divine craftsmanship and purpose, we encounter something that should give us pause. For the Takenouchi Documents speak in remarkably similar terms of the gods creating humanity, of divine beings shaping the races of mankind, of a time when heaven and earth were not so distant from one another and the purposes of creation were clear and known. The Sumerian king list tells us that when the gods first gave human beings the gifts necessary for cultivating society, they did so by establishing the city of Eridu in the region of Sumer, and kingship descended from heaven like a blessing, a gift of order and governance bestowed upon humanity by divine will. The first kings were not elected, not chosen by their fellow humans, but appointed directly by the gods themselves, selected for their wisdom and their capacity to maintain the sacred order that kept chaos at bay. Before kingship took its familiar form, the city-states of Sumer were theocracies, ruled by priests and religious officials who served as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. And even after kings rose to prominence, the priests continued to exert tremendous influence, for governance was never merely political in those ancient days, but always carried the weight of cosmic responsibility. And when we read in the Takenouchi Documents that the Sumera Mikoto would decide who would be king of a region and who would not, that this divine emperor held the power to appoint or remove rulers based upon their governing abilities, we cannot help but notice how perfectly this mirrors the Sumerian conception of divinely ordained kingship, of authority flowing downward from heaven, rather than rising upward from the earth. The Sumera Mikoto, according to those controversial Japanese texts, divided the world into 16 regions with Japan at its center, establishing a world government of unprecedented scope, and the kings of each region served at the pleasure of this divine sovereign. Their legitimacy derived not from conquest or inheritance alone, but from heavenly mandate. This parallel between the Sumerian and Japanese traditions of sacred kingship invites contemplation. For either we are witnessing the independent emergence of similar ideas in response to similar human needs, or we are glimpsing fragments of some older tradition that predates both civilizations, some original template for the relationship between gods and mortals that was carried across the ages and across the world by means we can now only guess at. The concept of benevolent divine rule, of kings who served as shepherds of their people rather than merely as wielders of power, appear both through traditions with striking consistency, suggesting perhaps that the ancients understood something about governance that we in our modern age have sometimes forgotten. And then there are the floods. Every culture, it seems, remembers a time when the waters rose and the world was unmade, when divine judgment fell upon humanity like rain from an angry sky, and only a remnant survived to begin again. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki gods deciding to unleash a catastrophic flood upon the earth, though the reasons given vary from text to text, sometimes punishment for human noise and overpopulation, sometimes simply the inscrutable will of the divine. The flood narratives found in Mesopotamian literature predate the more famous biblical account by centuries, and they share with it a common structure of warning, preparation, survival, and covenant. The Takenouchi Documents, too, speak of cataclysms, of ages when the advanced civilization of the divine era was swept away by catastrophe, and these Japanese accounts have been noted as highly compatible with many mythologies around the world, including those of the Hopi, the Dogon, and indeed the ancient Sumerians, all of which refer to a great flood and the arrival of beings who transmitted spiritual knowledge to the survivors. Perhaps most haunting of all are the underworld journeys, those descents into darkness that appear in both traditions with eerie similarity. The Japanese myth of Izanagi, descending into the land of the dead, to retrieve his beloved Izanami, only to find her corrupted by death and be forced to flee from her wrath, echoes across cultures with variations but consistent themes. This quest for the lost beloved in the realm of shadows is reminiscent of the Greek Orpheus seeking Eurydice in Hades, but scholars have noted that it bears even closer resemblance to the Sumerian myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld, that ancient tale of the goddess who passed through 7 gates, surrendering a piece of her divine regalia at each one until she stood naked before the throne of death itself. These parallels in underworld mythology suggest either a deep psychological truth about human experience that manifests independently across cultures, or some thread of transmission that carried these stories from one people to another across the millennia. And then we come to perhaps the most visually striking connection of all, the symbol that bridges these distant civilizations with its perfect geometry. The 16-petal chrysanthemum, the crest of the Sumera Mikoto, according to the Takenouchi Documents, was this very flower, its 16 petals symbolizing the 16 regions of the world government. And this same symbol remains to this day the imperial seal of Japan, appearing on the passports of Japanese citizens, on the gates of shrines, on the official documents of the imperial household. But here is what should arrest our attention. The 16-petal chrysanthemum has not only been used in Japan. This identical symbol appears on the Ishtar Gate of Babylon, that magnificent blue-tiled entrance to the ancient city, built during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century before the Common Era. It appears at the Alhambra Palace in Spain, carried there perhaps by the currents of cultural exchange that flowed along the Silk Road and through the Islamic world. It has been identified in locations throughout Rome, Egypt, and elsewhere across the ancient world. Always this same flower, always these same 16 petals, as if some original symbol had been scattered across civilizations like seeds cast upon the wind. The imperial seal of Japan and the decorative motifs of Mesopotamia share this form. And while some scholars attribute this to coincidence or to the natural human tendency to find beauty in radial symmetry, others see in this distribution of symbols evidence of ancient contact, of knowledge transmitted across distances that should have been impassable, of a common source from which both traditions drew their sacred imagery. We cannot prove, with the evidence available to us, that these connections represent genuine historical contact between ancient Japan and ancient Sumer. For proof of such magnitude would require archaeological discoveries we have not yet made, linguistic analyses that remain inconclusive, and perhaps the recovery of documents that were lost to war and time. What we can say is that these parallels exist, that they are numerous and detailed and resistant to easy dismissal, and that they invite us to contemplate the possibility that human history is deeper and stranger than the conventional narrative suggests. Perhaps the Sumerians and the Japanese independently developed similar cosmologies because similar questions yield similar answers when asked by minds shaped by similar needs. Perhaps the flood stories spread from a single historical event, remembered differently by different peoples. Perhaps the chrysanthemum seal is nothing more than a pleasing geometric form that appeals to the human eye wherever it appears. Or perhaps, as the alternative theorists suggest, there was once a source civilization, a golden age before our recorded history began, from which both Sumer and Japan inherited fragments of a common wisdom, we do not have to choose definitively between these possibilities tonight. We need only acknowledge that the questions exist, that the parallels are real, and that somewhere in the space between certainty and mystery, there may yet be truths waiting to be discovered. As we move deeper into our contemplation of these ancient mysteries, we must now turn our attention to the questions that inevitably arise when we consider such extraordinary claims. Questions that deserve our careful consideration, even as we maintain the spirit of wonder that has carried us this far through the night. The mainstream scholarly opinion today holds that the Takenouchi Documents are nothing more than a hoax, and an elaborate one at that, a fabrication created in more recent times rather than a genuine transmission from the ancient past. Some researchers maintain that these documents may have their roots in authentic tradition, that beneath the layers of embellishment there might lie kernels of genuine historical memory. Yet, with the original text now missing, lost in the fires of war and the chaos of history, this remains one mystery that will probably never be solved to the satisfaction of those who demand concrete evidence. We must acknowledge with honesty and without judgment that there are those who believe these documents served purposes far removed from the preservation of sacred truth. According to the researcher Ichiro Yamane, the Takenouchi Documents were propagandistic texts, written or at least heavily modified by elements within the Japanese military establishment to justify imperial expansion and to support the idea that the Japanese emperor had a divine right to rule not just Japan, but the entire world. When we remember that according to these documents, humanity itself began in Japan, and that Japanese emperors once ruled over all the peoples of the earth, we can understand why such texts might have been useful to those seeking to promote a particular political agenda during the turbulent decades of the early 20th century. This is a sobering consideration, a reminder that sacred texts and ancient wisdom can be wielded as tools of power just as easily as they can serve as vessels of genuine spiritual insight. Similarly, we must acknowledge that the modern interpretations of the Sumerian Anunnaki that present them as extraterrestrial visitors have been universally rejected by mainstream historians and archaeologists, who have labeled such theories as pseudo-archaeology, as speculation that goes far beyond what the ancient texts actually say. The scholars who have devoted their lives to studying the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, who have learned to read the wedge-shaped impressions that Sumerian scribes pressed into clay thousands of years ago, these experts tell us that the Anunnaki, as they appear in authentic ancient texts, were gods within a mythological system, divine beings who played roles in religious narratives, rather than flesh and blood visitors from distant stars. The Anunnaki were real in the sense that they appear in genuine ancient documents, real as cultural and religious concepts that shaped the worldview of the Sumerian people. But the extraterrestrial Anunnaki of modern alternative history belong to contemporary reinterpretation rather than to ancient tradition. This distinction between what ancient texts actually say and what modern writers have claimed they say is crucial for anyone seeking to understand these mysteries with intellectual honesty. None of this means we must dismiss these traditions entirely or mock those who find meaning in them, for there are other ways to approach such material that honor both critical thinking and the human need for wonder and meaning. Hidden narratives persist across generations when they resonate emotionally with something deep within the human spirit, when they offer what mainstream explanations sometimes fail to provide. These alternative histories speak to a sense of lost knowledge, a feeling that modern humanity has forgotten something important about its own origins. They offer explanations for human origins that feel more meaningful to some than the cold mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection. They challenge institutional authority at a time when many have lost faith in the pronouncements of experts and officials. They provide a mythic framework for understanding modern feelings of distrust and alienation, a narrative that explains why the world feels so disconnected from the sacred. We need not accept these alternative histories as literal truth to recognize why they hold such power over the human imagination. Even when taken symbolically rather than literally, the ancient myths of the Anunnaki remain deeply meaningful, for they reflect concerns that have troubled humanity since the very beginning of civilization. The tension between Enlil and Enki in Sumerian mythology, between the stern god of order and the clever god of wisdom, mirrors the enduring human conflict between authority and creativity, between obedience and innovation, between following the rules and breaking them to achieve something new. These are not merely ancient stories, but living patterns that repeat themselves in every human society, and perhaps in every human heart. As for the Takenouchi documents themselves, whatever their ultimate origin, we cannot simply ignore the fact that they represent a transmission that has been protected and preserved by Japanese shaman clans at the risk of their lives for centuries. Whether these keepers of tradition were guarding genuine ancient wisdom or elaborate medieval fabrications, their dedication speaks to the profound human need to maintain connection with the past, to preserve what one believes to be sacred truth against the erosion of time and the hostility of authorities who would suppress it. The family of Takeuchi suffered imprisonment and persecution for their beliefs, and the documents they guarded were confiscated and ultimately destroyed in the fires of World War II. This history of suffering and loss deserves our respect, even if we cannot verify the truth of the claims contained within the documents themselves. Perhaps the most profound questions raised by our exploration tonight are not about whether these specific documents are authentic or whether ancient aliens really visited the Earth, but rather about the deeper patterns of human storytelling and the remarkable similarities that appear in myths and legends from cultures around the world. The great folklorist Vladimir Prop, who dedicated his life to the study of narrative structures, wrote that all questions relating to the study of tales lead eventually to the solution of the highly important and yet unresolved problem of the similarity of tales throughout the world. Why do flood myths appear in cultures from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from the ancient Near East to the islands of the Pacific? Why do stories of divine beings descending from the heavens to teach humanity the arts of civilization echo across continents and centuries? Why do so many cultures remember a golden age in the distant past when gods walked among mortals and life was more harmonious than it is today? Scholars of comparative mythology have noticed numerous parallels between the stories of the ancient Sumerians and those recorded later in the early parts of the Hebrew Bible, suggesting that ideas and narratives flowed between cultures across the ancient Near East. Sumerian religion heavily influenced the religious beliefs of later Mesopotamian peoples, with elements of Sumerian mythology retained in the traditions of the Hurrians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and other culture groups who inhabited the region in subsequent millennia. Ideas travel, stories migrate, and what begins as a local legend in one river valley can eventually find its way to distant lands where it takes on new forms while retaining echoes of its original shape. Perhaps the similarities between Japanese and Sumerian traditions that we have explored tonight are evidence of ancient contact between these civilizations, of migrations and cultural exchanges that conventional history has not yet recognized. Or perhaps these similarities arise because human beings everywhere, regardless of where they live or what language they speak, share certain fundamental experiences and ask certain fundamental questions about their existence. We are all born, we all struggle to survive, we all wonder where we came from and why we are here, we all face death and wonder what, if anything, lies beyond it. Perhaps the similarities in our myths reflect not ancient contact, but the universal structure of the human mind itself. The archetypes that Carl Jung believed were inherited patterns residing in the collective unconscious of our species. We may never know with certainty which explanation is correct, whether the myths of the world point to forgotten historical connections, or to the shared architecture of human consciousness, or perhaps to some combination of both. And perhaps that uncertainty is not a failure but a gift, an invitation to keep wondering, to keep questioning, to keep exploring the mysteries that make human existence so endlessly fascinating. As our journey begins to draw toward its close, let us not grasp too tightly at conclusions or demand answers that may not be available to us. The ancient Sumerians are long gone, their cities buried beneath the sands of Iraq, their language fallen silent thousands of years ago. The original Takenouchi documents, if they ever existed in the form their guardians claimed, were consumed by fire decades ago. What remains are fragments, echoes, copies of copies, translations of translations, and the enduring human desire to understand where we came from and what our presence on this small planet ultimately means. Let the questions themselves be your companions as you continue to rest and reflect. Let the uncertainty be not troubling but peaceful, a reminder that the universe is far vaster and stranger than any of us can fully comprehend. In the space between knowing and not knowing, between certainty and mystery, there is room for wonder. And wonder is perhaps the most precious gift that these ancient stories can offer to those who approach them with open minds and humble hearts. And so we arrive at the final passage of our journey together, this long and winding exploration through the mists of time and the depths of human memory. And as we prepare to bring our contemplation to a gentle close, it seems fitting to pause and reflect on what we have discovered and what remains beautifully unknown. The Kojiki, that ancient Japanese chronicle of myths and legends and hymns and genealogies and oral traditions and semi-historical accounts dating as far back as the year 641, has served for centuries as a window into the origin of the Japanese archipelago and the kami and the Japanese imperial line, preserving stories that have shaped the spiritual life of an entire civilization. More than simply an invaluable historical source or an entertaining compilation of Japanese mythology, the Kojiki stands as the very cornerstone of the Shinto religion, the foundation upon which its Gods and rituals and sacred practices have been built across countless generations of devoted practitioners. These texts remind us that every culture, every people, every civilization that has ever existed has felt the profound need to tell stories about where we came from and why we are here and what our place might be in the vast and mysterious cosmos. The Takenouchi Documents remain shrouded in controversy and uncertainty, their original forms lost to the fires of war and the passage of time, leaving us with copies and translations and interpretations that may or may not preserve whatever truth they once contained. We cannot say with certainty whether these manuscripts hold genuine memories of a forgotten age or whether they represent a more recent creation, whether the parallels with Sumerian tradition point to actual historical connections or merely reflect the universal patterns that emerge whenever human beings try to make sense of their existence. And perhaps, in the quiet honesty of this moment, we must acknowledge that there is much we simply do not know and may never know about the distant past, about the origins of our species, about the experiences of our ancestors who lived so long ago that their very existence seems almost mythical to us now. The limits of historical knowledge are real and humbling, for we peer back through time as though through a glass darkly, catching glimpses and fragments and echoes of what once was but never quite, seeing the full picture in all its original clarity. Yet there is something beautiful in this uncertainty, something that invites us not to frustration, but to wonder, not to despair, but to that gentle curiosity that has always driven human beings to ask questions and seek answers and tell stories to one another in the darkness. Why do we tell origin stories at all? Why have human beings in every time and place felt compelled to narrate the beginning of things, to explain how the world came to be and how humanity found its place within it? Perhaps it is because we sense, somewhere deep within ourselves, that we are part of something larger than our individual lives, something that stretches back before our birth and will continue long after we are gone. The ancient stories connect us to that larger something. They weave us into the fabric of time and meaning. They remind us that we are not alone in our wondering and our hoping and our fearing. Whether the Anunnaki were actual beings who descended from the heavens or powerful symbols through which ancient peoples made sense of forces beyond their understanding, whether the Sumera Mikoto truly ruled a unified world in some forgotten golden age, or represented an ideal of wise and benevolent governance that inspired generations of Japanese thought, these stories carry meaning that transcends the question of literal historical accuracy. There is comfort in connecting ourselves to ancient traditions, in feeling that the questions we ask today are the same questions that burned in the hearts of our ancestors thousands of years ago, in recognizing that the human experience has always included this yearning to understand and to belong. The myths and legends of old continue to inspire us, continue to spark our imagination, continue to offer us frameworks for thinking about the deepest questions of existence, even as our scientific knowledge grows and our technological powers expand. Perhaps that is the true gift of these ancient narratives. Not that they provide definitive answers, but that they teach us how to live with mystery, how to embrace the unknown, how to find peace in the midst of uncertainty. And now, as our journey together draws toward its close, as the final passages of this contemplation unfold like the last light of evening, fading into the gentle darkness of night, we return to where we began, to the soft chime of shrine bells echoing across misty mountains and the whisper of desert winds through ancient ruins. The mystery remains intact, as it must, as perhaps it should, for some questions are not meant to be answered so much as they are meant to be lived, to be carried with us like precious stones whose value lies not in their usefulness, but in their beauty. We have traveled together through the temples of Sumer and the shrines of Japan, through stories of gods who descended from the heavens and emperors who claimed divine lineage, through controversies and connections, and the vast open spaces of what we do not and cannot know. If you have found something of value in this journey, some spark of wonder or moment of peace or thread of thought to carry with you into tomorrow, then this telling has served its purpose. The old stories do not demand that we believe them in any particular way. They simply ask that we listen, that we consider, that we allow ourselves to be touched by the eternal human need to understand where we come from and who we are. The shrine bells that opened our journey continue their ancient song, as they have for centuries, as they will for centuries yet to come. And the stars that watched over Sumer and Japan alike still shine in the darkness above us, indifferent perhaps to human wandering, yet somehow comforting in their constancy. We leave the Takenouchi Documents where we found them, suspended between history and legend, between scholarly dismissal and devoted preservation, neither proven nor disproven, but simply present, like so much of what we inherit from the past. We leave the Anunnaki in their ambiguous realm, those beings who from heaven to earth came according to ancient texts, powerful gods or symbolic figures, or perhaps something else entirely that our categories cannot quite contain. And we leave ourselves here in this present moment, heirs to all these stories and questions and mysteries, free to wonder and dream and draw our own conclusions, or to simply rest in the not knowing. The journey is complete, but also never complete, for these questions will be here tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as human beings continue to gaze up at the stars, and back through time, and inward to the depths of their own souls. What matters now is simply this moment, this breath, this gentle settling into whatever peace the night offers. Whether you have listened to every word or drifted in and out of attention, whether you found the connections compelling or the theories unconvincing, you have participated in something ancient and ongoing, this eternal human conversation about origins and meaning and the mysterious forces that have shaped our world. The mist still clings to sacred mountains in Japan, and the sands still shift over buried temples in Mesopotamia. And the great river of time continues its endless flow, carrying all our stories, all our hopes, all our wandering towards some destination we cannot see. Let the questions rest now. Let the mysteries keep their secrets a little longer. Let the ancient voices fade into a soft background murmur that asks nothing of you except your presence. Tomorrow, perhaps you will think again about Sumer and its gods, about Japan and its sacred texts, about the strange and wonderful possibility that human memory stretches back further than we know. But tonight, there is only this: the quiet after contemplation, the peace that comes when the mind has wandered far and is ready to return home to simple stillness. The bells grow faint now, barely audible across the distance, and the winds that once carried the words of God settle into silence. And in the great darkness that holds all things, all times, all places, there is rest. You are connected in this moment to everyone who has ever wondered about these things, to the Sumerian priests who watched the stars from their ziggurats, to the Japanese shamans who guarded sacred texts through generations of change, to all the seekers and dreamers and questioners who came before and all who will come after. That connection does not require answers. It does not require belief. It only requires this: the willingness to wonder, the openness to mystery, the humility to acknowledge how much we do not know. May you carry something gentle from this journey into your sleep. May your dreams be touched by ancient peace. May you wake tomorrow with wonder still alive in your heart. The stories will be here when you return to them. The questions will wait patiently for your attention. The mystery will remain, as it has always remained, patient and vast and strangely comforting in its endlessness. For now, let everything go. Let the words fade like the last light of day. Let your breath slow and your body settle and your mind drift wherever it wishes to go. The ancient ones, whether gods or ancestors or simply the best imaginings of long-ago peoples, offer their blessing across the ages, a blessing that asks nothing and gives everything, that welcomes you into the great family of wanderers and dreamers to which you have always belonged. Rest now in that belonging. Rest now in the mystery. Rest now in the peace that passes understanding, the peace that has always been waiting for you at the end of every journey and the beginning of every new dawn. The shrine bells have fallen silent. The desert winds have stilled, and in the vast and tender darkness you are held.